Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. Today, we're going to talk about where do people live. Really, it's the focus of population distribution and the consequences of population distribution. So, kind of our big ideas, the same big ideas we've focused on in Unit 1, we will focus on in Unit 2. So, spatial organizations, impacts of interactions, and spatial processes. So, those are kind of the big skills we work on throughout the whole entire course. So, population distribution is kind of our first topic. So let's talk about demographics. So that's the study of people. So really, it's simply the study of the Earth's human population. So the types of question that geographers would ask: what is it like living in different places? Where is the Earth's population distributed? Where have we seen major increases in population? What effects does that population have on the environment? And how countries affect their population. Those are all the questions that we're going to look for and try to answer throughout this unit. Some today and then some later throughout the course of the next 3 weeks. So where do people live? What is that? So population distribution is the pattern of human settlement, the spread of people across the earth. Basically, where do people live is one of the major things that geographers look at. The second piece about this is population density. This tells how clusters or dispersed the population is. So are people clustered in one area? Are they dispersed over the the whole country? What does it look like? Population density has increased significantly, but population distribution really has not. So there are more people living in very densely populated areas. The vast majority of people, because the vast majority of growth occurs in places that have already settled. So people continue to live in areas that they have already settled. So Eastern China is a really good example. This is one of the most heavily populated areas in our world. When we look at it today, in the 1800s, if we looked at a population density map of the 1800s, we would see it was still a highly densely populated map there. And if we look at one for today, it's very highly densely populated today. So Eastern China was one of the most populated parts of the world in the 1800s, and it still is today. So you're going to see that there's a lot of maps in this presentation for you to kind of look at and explore. So I love this map because it kind of shows the distribution of population. So each portion by color indicates approximately 1 billion people. So we have 7 billion people that live on Earth, more than 7 billion people actually. So where do these people live? And I love this because it kind of shows you where people are. So if we look at the Americas, both North and South America, you'll notice Greenland is part of North and South America. And we've included Australia and New Zealand as well in our ways to get to 1 billion people. There's a lot of not very densely populated areas in North and South America, and then Australia and New Zealand aren't heavily. They don't have very large populations. Then we look at our second area, which is Europe. That would include Europe, which is here, all of Russia. Okay, and then you'll notice too, it juts down into the Middle East, which the Middle East would include like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. Basically, it's the Arabian Peninsula is part of the Middle East. To get 1 billion people, we need all of this space. Basically, all of Africa. Africa has about 1 billion people in it. So all of Africa equals another billion people. Here's where it gets interesting is when we talking about Asia. This kind of pinkish purple color. We've got, I like to call them the stands. Kazakhstan, northern India, so part of India, a huge chunk of Western China, all of Mongolia, to get to the 1 billion people, including Nepal in this as well, and like Pakistan. These are pretty densely populated areas. So we get 1 billion people there. Then if we jet down here with India, so India alone has over 1 billion people. It just hit the billion mark in the last 5 years. Bangladesh, Myanmar are included with kind of the huger chunk of India, along with Sri Lanka. And then you have a part of East Asia, and this is pretty heavily populated, along with North, South Korea, and Japan. Japan and the Korean Peninsula, especially South Korea, is pretty densely populated. And then finally, we have another chunk of China. So I think it's interesting that China, we see China divided into 3 different areas because it does have such a large population, along with Laos and Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines. So if we were going to divide up those 7 billion people, this is how it would divide up where people live. So the distribution is not uniform. 2/3 of the world's population are inhabited in 4 distinct clusters. So I want you to try to think about where you think these clusters are. So take a minute, look at the population distribution map, and then you're going to pause the video and fill out the 4 clusters that you kind of think where they are. You can be very general in your thinking of where you are putting these clusters. So go ahead, pause the video, and fill out the 4 clusters. Okay, welcome back. I hope you have your 4 clusters done. So we're going to move forward and talk about where these 4 clusters are. So here's where the clusters are. The first is East Asia. About 25% of the world's population live in East Asia, which would include East China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. So just a couple of side notes for you. A lot of people always think, oh, China is really densely populated, and it is. It's in its cities, it's very densely populated, but about 50% of China is considered rural, which is a pretty big chunk of China. And Japan and Korea are kind of different. 75% is considered urban. So after I graduated from college, I lived in Japan for a year, and I can attest to it. I lived in what they considered the countryside, and it was a very, very urban area. There was no countryside. It was just building after building, cement after cement. So I would never consider it the countryside. So cluster 1 would be East Asia with China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Okay. Cluster 2 would be South Asia. This would include India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, with the concentrated areas being from Lahore, Pakistan, through India and into Bangladesh and the Bay of Bengal. So let's take a look at the map here really quick so I can just show you where that is. So we're talking about this area. Here's Pakistan here, and it's kind of this area that's that deep reddish and purplish color all through like northern India. And then here's Bangladesh, this kind of purple one right here. That is kind of where this cluster is. And just in case you're wondering where the East Asian cluster, we're talking this part of China here, North, South Korea, and Japan. These are all countries that you should be working towards knowing where they're located, that you know this is India. Pakistan's a really important country. Bangladesh is probably a country you maybe haven't even ever heard of, but it's an important country to know because it has such a huge population, and it's very, very poor. Okay, and everyone should know where China is, North, South Korea, and Japan as well. Okay, so with South Asia, there are 2 rivers that kind of make up where the population is where these 2 rivers are. The Indus and the Ganges rivers flow through this region of Pakistan and northern India and into Bangladesh. That's where the majority of the population live. And actually, very much like China, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, about 50% of those or more is considered rural. So where people live, it's very heavily concentrated. And then when you walk away from those heavily concentrated areas, it becomes much, much ruraler. The third cluster is in Europe. So in Europe, about 3/4 of the population live in cities. There's fewer than 10% farmers in any area. And then, of course, our highest concentration in Europe are going to be along rivers and where coal fields traditionally have been in Germany and Belgium, and then historical cities like London and Paris. So we're talking about Europe here. Okay, again, countries that you should know: the United Kingdom, which is where London is; France, which is where Paris is; and then we're talking about Germany. The population is very much along rivers, and then Belgium is here, kind of, it's pretty small. Those are kind of your key kind of cluster areas for population. And then the 4th cluster is actually Southeast Asia. There are 60 million people living on a series of islands between the Indian and Pacific Ocean. Indonesia, which is an island chain nation, has about the 4th most populous country in the world, which would be China, India, the United States, and then finally Indonesia. So it is a very, very heavily populated area. Most of the population is concentrated in Java, which is the capital, with about 100 million people. And then Indochina and the Philippines are important regions as well. So let's take a look. Here is Indonesia. Okay. So this is kind of this stream of islands that kind of runs through here. Here's the Philippines. This is where 100 million people live on these islands, which, can be very challenging. And then other clusters to talk about. The United States is definitely, North America has clusters in the Western Hemisphere, Northeastern United States, Southeastern Canada. There's some clusters along the Atlantic coast in Africa where there's some pretty big population areas. So really you're talking about the Northeast here, and both the United States and Canada are heavily populated. Africa, we're talking about kind of right in here. It's pretty heavily populated. South America has a little bit along the coast as well. It's just not as much as other regions of, the earth. So those are your cluster areas. So we're going to talk about where humans host a permanent settlement, and that's called East Union zones, and that's where these are where human settlements have been. So the thing about this is for much of our history, we've lived in the same locations. But as humans have dispersed across the globe and technology and innovations have changed, this really allows for us to adapt to new environments. So I love this picture. I believe this is a golf course in the desert. It's the most ridiculous thing because this would have to be watered all the time, which is a really huge waste of our water resources. But, we're able to do that. We have the technology to do that. So we can adapt to new environments. This is interesting too, because this is where we see intense settlement. So you can kind of see the intense settlements and then the intense settlements across time. Okay. Are throughout history. So this is 5000 BC. So there's not really any intense settlements. There's smaller scale agriculture. There's quite a bit of hunter, like everything else is hunting and gathering. So, the Middle East and in parts of Europe, 5000 BC, and a little bit in Eastern Asia. That's it, really, in 5000 BC. Then by 1500 AD, I'm going the wrong way. 1 AD, you can see there's more human settlement, heavily populated on the Mediterranean coast throughout Europe, Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, some small scale agriculture in Central Africa and in South America, more intense settlement with the Incas in South America, and not much happening in North America. Some of the Native American groups, the Aztecs and the Mayas in Central America, and then we have a little bit of small scale agriculture happening kind of in the United States. Then when we go to 1500, this is during the time of exploration. So things are really beginning to change. Again, you can kind of see much more intensive agriculture. Still the United States, out west, there's not a lot happening. Just think about 1500 and what's happening in our own personal country. We still haven't explored huge chunks of North America. And then finally 1900. So just a little bit over 120, almost 120 years ago, or it really is 120 years ago, what we're looking at. And I think you would see agriculture looks fairly similar today as it did in 1900, just the zones. So we talked about site and situation during Unit 1. So let's just go back to that. What is site? What is situation? So where are there population clusters and what's the site and situation of those? So most people live in low-lying areas with very fertile soil and a temperate climate. So the climate is pretty comfortable. It's a low-lying area, fertile soil. And most people live near an ocean or a river with easy access to the ocean. We're a little bit of an exception here in the United States because we can house some pretty heavily populated areas in the um, middle of our country, but a lot of that is because we have the Mississippi. We have a pretty big river system in the United States that we can transport goods on. So these are common traits where people live. Almost 90% of all people live north of the equator. The northern hemisphere houses most of our population. And I attribute a lot of that to where there's land. There's just not a lot of land, as much land in the southern hemisphere. Like, take a look at a globe. Most of the land is in the northern hemisphere. And that would be the reason why 90% of the population lives in the northern hemisphere. Most people live in areas close to the sea. We do not live close to the sea. We're kind of an exception to that rule, but when you start looking at where population clusters are, you're going to see that most people live close to the sea. More than half of all the people live on about 5% of the land, and almost 9/10 on less than 20%. So really the population clusters that we talked about earlier, that's where most people live. And it's about 5% of our total land mass. About 2/3 of the world's population is concentrated within 300 miles of the ocean. Again, we're kind of an oddity here where we live because we don't live 300 miles to the ocean. So we're in the 1/3 that does not. So where people live and where they don't live? Too cold, too wet, too high, too dry. Those are places people don't live. So take a look at this map and think about where people would live and where people wouldn't live, and what you know about population clusters. So taking a look at these two maps, list 5 places people don't live and why. Be specific, okay? So take a minute, pause the video. Why 5 places people don't live and why. Be specific with your answers. Go ahead and pause. Okay, welcome back. So you should have your 5 places done. So we're going to move on ahead and just look at a couple of different maps for you to think about. This is climate zones. Okay, most people live in a temperate climate zone. So most people are living in the green areas of the world. And think about your population clusters, where they are. So usually you're going to see people living in the temperate zone, maybe in the subtropical zone, and then in some cases the tropical zone. There's large population clusters as well. This is our population density in 2015. So take a quick look at this. You can see where things are heavily populated. If you look over here in India, this is along the Ganges River, just below the Himalayas. You can see in East Asia. But I think the reddest piece on the map is in India, where you have the highest population density. So there's a lot of factors that attribute to where we live. There are physical factors, which would be the climate, the landforms, the water, bodies of water, and human factors, the culture, the economy, the history, the politics. This really influences the distribution of people. So we have to go back to what we talked about a couple weeks ago, which is the idea of possibilism, that we are able to overcome environmental obstacles. As a result, humans have more options when it comes to where they choose to live. Do you choose cultural reasons, family, friends, religion, jobs, which would be economic, the history, the politics of your place, where you choose to live? So when we talk about culture, these are areas in the United States. We have Little Italy, a Chinatown. These are places where people chose to live because of the culture of that area, the enclave. The grouping of people who lived there were mostly Chinese immigrants or Italian immigrants. And they created this almost like mini town within a town. Could it be based on religion? Do people live in certain places because of a religion? So we have Islam here, or Judaism, or Christianity. Are people choosing areas because of the religion? So these are areas with wealth, the top areas with wealth. So you can kind of see New York is number 1. London is number 2, and number 3 is Tokyo. But where do things fall after that? So those 3 cities are considered world cities. They're kind of the three most important cities in the world, and they hold most of the economic power and money. But then you have other cities that are popping up here. The San Francisco Bay Area is number 4, and a lot of that is because of our tech industry is kind of housed in that area. Beijing, China is a real up and coming kind of area. You'll notice that Shanghai, which is also in China, is number 6. Okay, 7 would be Los Angeles, again coming from kind of some of that tech, a lot of tech industries. This area has really skyrocketed. Hong Kong, which is, part of China, is number 8. Sydney, Australia, is 9. Okay, Singapore, a major trading center for Asia. Singapore is a very wealthy city-state. It's very small. It's like the size of a city, is number 10. 11 is Chicago, so close to us. Where are we at? 12 is Mumbai in India. So it's interesting. India has a very large population, but as for cities with the most important worldwide wealth, they're still pretty low in the scale with just being at 12. 13 is Toronto in Canada, and then 14 and 15 are in Frankfurt and Paris, so Germany and France. So those are kind of your top 15 worldwide cities with the most wealth. I love this map because I think it tells you a lot. So the area kind of in the center, which includes Europe, North America, and Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, 73% of the world's income is found in this area of the world, but only 14% of the population. Okay. Outside of that is 27% of the world's wealth and 86% of the world's population. So what does that tell you about money and where people live? I think it tells you where the wealth is in our country and how people are living outside of this walled area. We have a lot of advantages when it comes to wealth here in the United States, and same that we're seeing in Europe and Australia as well, and Japan too. I think it's important to look at when we look at who has been under European control and start thinking about the impact that has on those countries too. So you can see colonized by or controlled by Europe is the green color. Never colonized by Europe, that's where it gets interesting, because you would see it's really just Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Thailand. That's it. So everywhere else kind of had pretty heavy influence from European powers. Our very own political map from 2016 and what that means. I think if we looked at a population density map of the United States, where is the population heavily, where do people live in the United States? So we already kind of determined, this, the Northeast, which you'll see the Northeast too is fairly blue, which cities tend to be more Democratic and rural areas tend to be more Republican. So you can see the rural areas where there's much fewer people tend to be more red. And then of course the West Coast, which people tend to live mostly in cities, tend to go more blue. So politics too, the Canadian military, they have one of the highest military bases called Albert. It's the most northerly community in the world. And it's basically to watch the Russians, to see what they're doing in the Arctic regions, because the Arctic is one of the regions that is kind of up for grabs. There's a lot to be gained by drilling in the Arctic. The resources that are there, especially as the things melt, there's a lot there. And so who's going to get access to those makes a difference. So this is a cartogram. We talked about cartograms last week, and this shows population. So where in the world is the population located? Canada is the second largest country in the world land area, but it's 37th in population. So you can barely see Canada. Look at it, it's right here. It's a very thin strip of land. Bangladesh, which is right here, is 92nd in land area, but 8th in population. So it's a pretty small country with a lot of people. I love cartograms. I think they can tell you some pretty interesting data. So you're going to need to define methods geographers use to calculate population density. And basically, geographers use 3 different ways to calculate population density. The first is arithmetic density, and that's the amount of people in a certain area. This is what you generally see when you see a population density. There's physiological density, the amount of people within the arable or farmable land of a certain area. And then there's agricultural density, and this is the amount of farmers within the arable land of a certain area. So let's break those down a little bit. So arithmetic density shows and labels the human created boundaries, such as countries, states, cities, and capitals. It's calculated by dividing a region's population by total area. So example, the United States population as of 2015 is 320 million people. So the United States total area, so that's area per square mile, is 3,841 square miles. So you take those two and divide, and our arithmetic density is about 83.6 people per square mile. Now, that doesn't tell us anything about the population distribution. That just tells us our overall population density. Okay, so what is our population density for the United States is roughly 83.6 people per square mile. Now, there's a lot of places in the United States, like we could go to Montana, and there are definitely not 86 people per square mile. Okay, we could go places in Illinois, but we go to like Chicago, and we're way above 86 people, 83.6 people per square mile. We're much higher than that. So it doesn't really show us anything about distribution. So you have things that are evenly distributed, you have cluster, and then you have linear distributed. So evenly distributed is just kind of people are spread out like per square mile everywhere. It's kind of evenly done. You have clusters where more people say live. If this is a county, more people live in the northern part of it. That's where the town is. And then the southern part is very rural. You kind of have that with Winnebago County. Like the population is really going to be clustered around Rockford, Chesney Park, Loves Park, Roscoe. But then if we were to go out to some of the rural areas, maybe in Winnebago, we would not have the population density. Okay. And then there's linear distribution, which this is a little bit interesting, but usually you have something that draws people to live near there. So if we were to look at cities, where cities are now, let's say in like Kansas and Nebraska, they have a linear distribution, and that's because that's where the railroad went through. So where the railroad went through, cities popped up because they could get services and goods there along the railroad. So there's a linear distribution of people. Same with roadways. So as roads were built, cities kind of developed. You have more, the cities follow the road. It's a linear distribution. So take a minute and think about what do these have in common? What are the differences? And then pause the video and then start it back up when you're done. Okay, so moving on. So persons per square kilometer. Okay, you can kind of see where we fall according to this map, which is interesting. According to this, we follow below 50%, but when we calculated it just now, we were at more like the 50 to 99. But you can see like India, because there's so many more people, and it's not small, but it's not the largest country. We're about 200 or above. Same in Pakistan. But like China, which has over 1 billion people in it, is still 100 to 199 because it's roughly the size of the United States. So it's a pretty large area. So we're looking at the arithmetic and the physiological population densities. Okay, so here's their arithmetic density. Here's the physiological density. Here's their arable land. Remember, arable land is land that you can farm. Okay, so here's the United States. We're about at 84. Here's Singapore. And remember, Singapore, we said, was a pretty small, island nation. So look at the arithmetic density here is 19,000. Okay, 19,000 people per square mile. That's a lot. So the physiological density calculated by dividing the population by the amount of arable land suitable for growing crops. Because it's really important that you have enough arable land to feed your whole population. So the good example is Egypt. Egypt has 2.8% arable land. It's a desert region. The only arable land is right on the Nile River, but it has a very high population. So the physiological population is 8,078 people per square mile. The arithmetic density is only 226. But when they're comparing it to the amount of arable land, it becomes much higher. So this large gap indicates that a small percentage of land is capable of growing crops and indicates the need for greater crop yields or other food sources. So they're going to have to bring in a lot of food sources because they have a very high population and not a lot of arable land. The physiological density is more useful than the arithmetic density when trying to determine a region's carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is the population it can support without significant environmental deterioration. So we don't want to destroy our environment. We have to find a way to balance it all, feed everyone, but grow enough crops for everyone. That's your carrying capacity. Not all countries can produce higher yields and must import food. So they have to bring food in. Egypt and Japan both supplement crops through the fishing industry and importing food. But paying for it is easier for developing countries. So Japan, it's much easier to bring food in because they are more developed. Their people that live there generally have more money than comparing it to Egypt, which is generally a lower developed country. So the Sahel region of Africa, which is the region kind of just below the Sahara Desert, and it kind of surrounds the rainforest, including much of the country of Mali, is threatened by overpopulation. The number of people living here is not very high, but the capacity of the environment to support life is extremely low. These people are chopping down one of the few remaining trees. So the carrying capacity, even though their population isn't that high, their carrying capacity is so low, it makes their physiological density very high. The population that can be supported without significant environmental deterioration. So they're killing their environment. So here is our map of persons per kilometer of arable land. So when we look at arithmetic and physiological population densities, you can see that the United States has 498 physiological density, and because we have 16.8% arable land. Singapore, on the other hand, physiological density, is 2,498,000 because they have 0.8% arable land. So they have a very small percentage of arable land. Excuse me. Then our final density is agricultural density, and this compares the number of farmers to the area of arable land. It provides an indication of the efficiency of the region's farmers. So developed countries need less farmers because they use more technology. Very similar to the United States. You're going to see that we don't actually have that many farmers per our agricultural density is fairly low because we use a lot of technology. In countries that are very poor, let's say in parts of Africa, less developed countries, you're going to have more farmers because it's very labor intensive because they don't have the ability to access a lot of technology. So here we go, Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world. The arithmetic density is 2,914 people per square mile. Physiological is 4,938 people per square mile, and agriculturally it's 431 per square mile, which is a lot. The Netherlands, by comparison, so its arithmetic is 1,044 people per square mile. Physiological is 3,505 per square mile, and agricultural is 31 people per square mile. It's a big difference. Much more economically developed the Netherlands are compared to Bangladesh. So farmers per square mile, so you can kind of see where everybody falls. You're going to notice much above 100. You're going to notice a pretty large chunk of Africa and parts of Asia. These are countries that tend to be less developed. So explain how each method reveals different information about the pressures the population exerts on the land. Think about, hint is to think in terms of carrying capacity, arable land, and farmers. So take a minute and pause the video and answer the question. Okay, you should have that finished. And we're going to finish up with consequences of population distribution. So the economic and political and social consequences, businesses earn more when located near large customer bases. Manufacturing plants are closer to large labor forces. So we're going to spend a lot of time towards the end of the semester talking about some of these factors. The Supreme Court requires state legislators to create electoral districts of reasonable and equal population size. So each representative serves approximately the same people. Redistricting occurs every 10 years. We'll actually redistrict next year because we just did the census. If you have not done you should ask your families if they've done the census. And if they have not, you should do the census. It really helps your area that you live in. Urban districts usually smaller than rural because there's more people. And services such as schools, police stations are usually positioned close to concentrations of population. So infrastructure and urban services, when people want to live in a particular region, they drive up the population density. The benefits usually are you are provided services, sewer, water, snow plowing, policing is more cost effective in high density areas. The cost mostly comes from labor, not the size of the pipe being used. The challenge is contaminating of the water supply from a downtown area can make thousands of people ill or sick. Think about what you did with the cholera epidemic. That was all from one place in a very urban area. If you haven't looked at what happened in Detroit, Michigan, take a look about what happens when the water became contaminated, and it really has heavily impacted children, the lead poisoning. So high density housing versus single family homes. Centers of big cities usually feature apartments and condos. In the Chicago Loop area, you're going to have about 21,000 people per square mile versus Machesney Park, which has an estimated population density of about 1,788 people per square mile. The environment and natural resources, overpopulation, more people than it can support. The carrying capacity, a higher population density creates a strain on the environment. Cities could be built on land with low carrying capacity, such as an area with poor soil, but for historical reasons, many are located on land with the greatest carrying capacity because that's where people initially lived. And historically, that's just continued. Other areas, pollution and depletion of resources. Many lakes and rivers no longer provide drinkable water and it must be piped in because of the pollution. So what do you think? What are the consequences of the population distribution surprised you? So you're going to put your answer here in the yellow bubble. And when you're done, move on. Finally, just some population centers. East Asia, we've kind of talked about some of these. You can see how heavily populated East Asia is, about 1.6 billion people. South Asia, again, this area from Lahore, here's Lahore, all the way to Bangladesh, here's Bangladesh, again, about 1.6 billion people. Europe is about 740 million people. And then Southeast Asia, which is this region, South China, is about 620 million people. So all three of the Asian regions are more than 50% rural on average, small farmers working on small plots. Europe is more than 3/4 urbanized. It is supported by a shrinking number of farmers who work on even larger farms using more technology. Japan is kind of the exception. It kind of resembles more of Europe. And we'll talk about the reason why that is later on, more in the political unit. So the northeastern United States is also a pretty notable concentration of population. We consider the Northeast a megalopolis, meaning it's kind of just this sense of people everywhere, like it's one city after another, and they kind of run into each other. The population is about 45 million people, from about Washington, D.C. up to Boston. is a megalopicus. Basically, it's one giant city. And then Nigeria, which is here in Africa, it's about 181 million people. And that's everything. So we've talked about a lot today, and I apologize for how long it is. Please let me know if you have any questions.